Welcome to Quantum Business Insights, emerging perspectives on people, process, and profits. Your host is Olivia Parr-Rud. In today's fast-paced, high-tech global economy, the business landscape is constantly evolving. To be successful, companies must continually adapt as well as identify and exploit new opportunities. Now, here is the host of Quantum Business Insights, Olivia Parr-Rud.
Welcome to Quantum Business Insights. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Each week on Quantum Business Insights, I explore the changing nature of business with thought leaders from around the world. My hope is that through dialogue and inquiry, we'll discover new approaches and perspectives that can help us all be more successful in our business. I especially want to draw attention to those systems and processes that take advantage of what I feel is our most valuable asset, our human capital. The topic for today's show is Designing Breakthrough Strategies with Quantum Planning. My guest is Gerald Harris, author of The Art of Quantum Planning, Lessons from Quantum Physics for Breakthrough Strategy, Innovation, and Leadership. Let me tell you a little bit about Gerald. He's president of the Quantum Planning Group and an associate with Rios Partners. He specializes in assisting businesses and organizations in a wide range of planning tasks, including scenario development, strategic planning, leadership team facilitation, and business plan development. He is an expert in helping organizations manage uncertainty and guiding them through going through scenario to strategy to implementation. Gerald has global experience in management consulting and has worked in many industries as a scenario-based strategy expert. He has a BA in economics and an MBA in finance and business economics, and he's led scenario projects for major U.S. and foreign organizations including AT&T, Chevron, Motorola, Pacific Gas and Electric, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Gerald, welcome to Quantum Business Insights.
How you doing? Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So in your book, The Art of Quantum Planning, you describe an approach to business strategy and planning that is informed by models from quantum physics. But you seem to have a very traditional business education. What led you to this unique approach, and how does it differ from traditional approaches?
Well, as you mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work with senior management teams and management teams thinking in the long term using scenario planning and other kind of strategic planning techniques. And what I discovered is very often the group will get into a stuck place. And most of that will be around some, preconceived notions, some set of beliefs, particularly old beliefs that they have, or, some kind of comfort zone. And I wanted a way to sort of give people a way to check their own thinking, to sort of get out of the box. And I discovered from watching a quite unusual film called What the Bleak Do We Know that there's some really radical ideas in quantum physics.
That's interesting, because I actually mentioned last week that was a movie that also opened me up to a lot of great ideas. So can you give me maybe an example of something in the movie that really got you thinking about this differently?
Well, there was a part in the movie where one of the scientists went through a conversation where he said he sort of would think about what he wanted to get accomplished that day, and then he would wait for these sort of small signals, and he would watch for these, and they would sort of guide him along the way. And I thought, wow, that's a really good way of combining an intention but also openness. And I think it's this openness concept that I'm really trying to get at in my book and in the ideas that I push. How do we open the mind and make ourselves more aware and sensitive?
I see. So maybe you get a thought, or you ask a question, and then you sort of wait for signals that you may be on the right track, or you might have to think differently or something like that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think it's sort of being aware, but at the same time having an intention. It reminds me, there's a story about when Steve Jobs many years ago went to visit Xerox PARC, which at that time was one of the leading R&D companies in the world. This was many years ago, before companies like Apple were really up and going. And there's a great story that he pays a visit to them, And he knew exactly what he was looking for in terms of the technology that he needed. They had no clue that he was thinking a million miles ahead of them. But he came in with this openness and this sensitivity, and he kind of found what he was looking for.
Oh, so it's like about being curious too, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely being curious, but I think it's a combination of having an intention but not having a preconceived notion as to what the answer is.
Got it. I see. So you don't go in there, right, with knowing the answer. You're more open to being surprised, perhaps.
That's right. Being surprised and also learning.
So in your book, you mention 7 ideas from quantum physics that can be translated for learning and planning in organizations. And so I'd like to ask you about these one at a time. The first idea from quantum physics is the particle-wave duality. Can you explain this and relate how it applies to business strategy and planning?
Well, it goes to what I think is one of the most fundamental flaws in thinking I've seen, not only in business, but even sometimes in my personal life, and that's what I call a false duality. This versus that, good versus bad. And what we find from quantum physics is that the universe actually doesn't work that way. That a subatomic particle, like an electron, can be either seen as a particle or a wave, depending on the point from which it's being observed. Again, the openness thing there, right? So the point is that this notion that there's always some this versus some that, and that's the complete way to think of it, that's the error. And we see it all the time. You can open up the newspaper, the Republicans against the Democrats or the right against the left or whatever, and we get stuck in these dualities thinking that that's the complete story, when the real story is some integrated whole, some way of combining those or even expanding beyond, the simple this versus that thinking that tends to come into place.
Right. So it sort of speaks to your earlier comment about your intention. That might actually affect the outcome in a way. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, if you come in with an intention that's already stuck in one place, mm-hmm. then you're going to generate that opposition, right? When someone wants to change their mind, they're going to have to assume this sort of opposite position, and then you're stuck in duality. And what I'm saying is that's where you make a mistake. Anytime you get stuck this versus a that versus a way of a sort of completed whole, you get in trouble. It reminds me of, and I think this is how powerful this is, the President of the United States made a very, very famous speech when he says, I'm not into red America or blue America, I'm into the United States of America. It was an electrifying statement.
Right.
And I think that's what I mean by looking at the whole as opposed to these false dualities.
Oh, I see. So do you have an example perhaps of a client with whom you were working where you described this and maybe something that came out of that in their plan or their strategy?
Well, basically, this is the core of scenario-based planning. What tends to happen in a business situation that I'll come in is that a company will have what we call an official future. This is what they believe how their business environment is going to work out. They've set their plans and strategies and corporate culture around it. So they have these, sort of a preconceived notion, right? A classic example probably that people can read up on is Lehman Brothers before its failure.
Oh.
Their view was that the whole, recession that we were going through was simply a blip on the screen, that real estate markets were going to come back very, very quickly. So they decided to double down on their strategy. Horrific mistake. But again, it's sort of this, you come into a situation with a preconceived notion. Now, what scenarios allow you to do is to have multiple views of the future, not just your official future view. And what I do with clients, I come in and I create probably 4 different worlds for them to strategize against, and therefore, one of them is their preferred or official future, but they will have at least 3 to 4 that are very, very different and challenging. And through that process, what I'm doing is changing their perspective, giving them an opportunity to learn, a deeper inquiry, and for new questions to arise.
you say the second idea from quantum physics that you've used is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And I especially like this one because with the rate of change in our economy, the amount of uncertainty is continuing to increase. So how do you define the Heisenberg uncertainty principle?
The simple way that I've seen it best explained is that you cannot simultaneously know the speed of an electron and its position, which is how fast is it moving and where is it? The problem is, as soon as you measure one, you influence your ability to measure the other.
Okay.
You can't know. You can only know one, which means there's an inherent uncertainty.
All right. So if I'm a business person, what would that mean to me? How would I use that information?
Let's go back to this official future concept, right? To me, the official future is you looking at the world as if it's a particle. It looks exactly like this. You got to capture it. Right?
I'm just definite that that's what's going to happen. Okay.
Right. But where is it going? That's the wave concept, right? The speed at which it is moving, right? And so that brings in this inherent uncertainty. So what I suggest to companies is that it's okay to have an intention in a particular strategy, but it's not okay not to have alternative scenarios or futures that give you some idea of where things may be going, and therefore how you may want to strategize proactively as opposed to reactively. You get surprised by everything. You open the paper and you find out that your competitor is on X, or there's some new entrant or some new player in the marketplace that you didn't expect, right? That's what I mean by the sort of more open, wave-oriented version of planning versus this sort of particle, we have it all figured out. It's exactly the way we think it's going to be, and we're stuck in our little comfort zone here. And therefore, you may have some what we call strategic options that you may have thought of in advance. So therefore, you're ready to take action as soon as you see some signal that now you know how to interpret because you've been open and you're learning and you're thinking, and therefore you move ahead. I mean, the classic company that has done this for years has been Royal Dutch Shell, where a lot of the sort of scenario approach was originated in business, and they've been doing it for years.
So we talked about the first two. The third idea you mentioned is that nothing is real until it is observed. To me, this is an amazing concept. What does this mean, and how can we apply it in business?
This is the one I also find most fascinating because I have to remind myself that it's my perception about something within my own mind that makes it what it is. There's a famous saying that I think it's Shakespeare that there's no good in evil, just thinking makes it so. And I think we sort of lose track of the fact that what we see and then how we process it in our own mind frames it, and then it determines what it is from our point of view. And that's what I want to emphasize, is just from your point of view.
So this might be filtered by, say, our past experience or our biases or things like that. Is that kind of what you mean?
They shape how you perceive things, right? So let's go back to the Lehman Brothers example I mentioned earlier. The reason Lehman thought that about the 2009 financial collapse was because they had experienced one before. And the company had doubled down and made lots of money.
Right.
They thought it was the same thing again.
And it's possible there were people in there that were saying, no, this may be different, but probably the overall management, they didn't want to hear that. They just didn't want to face the truth, I guess.
Right. I'll give you another example, which I find fascinating, which is, if you look at what's going on with the emergence of the iPhone, and what an impact that has had on the cell phone market. The BlackBerry company, as you know, is about to go under.
Really?
They're fading. But if you look at that, the history of that company, when the iPhone was released, the stock value of that company doubled afterwards.
Wow.
There was a 2-year lag thereabout between the entry of the iPhone and it began to, really take market share away from the BlackBerry, with other competitors as well. But I can imagine, when people were calling it, not only BlackBerry, but it was called, I hate to say it, the Kreiger. People were so addicted to these things. And they had huge market share in business. And there was no one in that company that would have believed at the time that Steve Jobs at Apple, which is a computer company, is any threat to us at all. They thought the iPhone was probably a toy.
Wow. That's amazing. And you just can think about all the new technologies that are being introduced. This is probably going on all the time, maybe on a smaller scale, but companies are suffering, and they don't even understand why.
Well, very often what happens is, there's a book out called The Innovators Solution by Craig Christensen at Harvard Business School, and he talks about how very often innovation is bottom-up, and it's serving those customers that the established players find, too cheap or too small of whatever to serve. There's a difficult part of the market. They don't make money there. What happens is someone comes in and they figure out how to make money on this part of the market that people are ignoring. And that becomes the basis of innovation from the bottom up. And that's why it's so very, very difficult to see this, because very often it's in some part of the market that the company has already decided to, pay no attention to.
Oh, right. Interesting. Let's go on. The fourth idea is the illusion of time and space. And I'm always looking for ways to stretch time. So I'd love to know more about this and how this could apply to business.
This one is it's probably more basic physics than it is, quantum physics. But, as we know, time is completely relative in terms of what time it is. For example, you're on the East Coast, and it's probably 6 o'clock your time. It's 3-something out here. But more importantly, there's a concept that people are still studying called entanglement. This is a situation where two related particles are sort of mirroring each other, but they're so far away, and the change is instantaneous, and they can't figure out there's no such thing as fast speed of light, but something seems to be going on here. The point that I make is that for some reason, time and the concept as we understand time does not limit the creativity of the universe. It just doesn't.
Can you give me an example of how someone might use that in their business or how that plays out perhaps in strategy and planning?
Two ways it plays out for me. One is the idea that there's a sequence in which things need to happen, that there's always some this before some that, and it follows, this way and that way, and things can only happen so fast or whatever. And what
like
happens
it's linear, yeah.
Yeah, people in the companies will get stuck in an ordered sequence. It's all in their mind. It doesn't exist in reality. And all it takes is some competitor to come along and re-scramble and go, oh, wow, you mean you didn't have to, wait for this thing.
Right. That reminds me of there was this fellow named Robert Kreiger. He wrote a book called Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers. and companies would hire him to go in and look for things like that people were missing. And I think he went into a company that made tires, Michelin or one of those companies, and he goes, why are you shrink wrapping your tires? And they said, well, to keep the white walls clean, but they had stopped making white wall tires years earlier. So it was just one of those things that they didn't see. That's really interesting.
Amazing. It's amazing. Yeah, I mean, people can get stuck in this, sequential thinking. And, very often what I'll do, I'll come into a company and I will have them do a little experiment. And I'll give them some cards and say, I'll tell you what you do. You tell me, I'll give you these 4 cards, and you tell me the sequence of which, some particular thing needs to happen. And they said, great. And everybody writes it down. And then I said, well, give your card to someone else, right? But I'm going to give this other person one additional card. Just here's one additional. So now we're from 4 to 5. And now they're going to resequence the same thing and then give it back to you and say, here's a different way to accomplish that, right?
Oh.
It's an amazing thing. People are just blown away. They had no idea that if I just changed this one thing, I could totally reorder the sequence of them.
That's brilliant. I love it. And I'll bet you get so many improvements that way because people are sort of forced to think in a nonlinear fashion. That's great.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it does a lot for team building as well.
Yeah.
Because if people know how to get engaged at that level and they go, wow, that's right, I never thought about that. Or, yeah, I mean, you can do it with something as simple as, how you get up in the morning and the steps you go through before you get out of the house.
Yeah, I've heard that as far as sort of waking up your creativity as you start doing things, maybe brush your teeth with the non-dominant hand and drive a different way to work. And all these things help sort of loosen the brain and get you to think a little bit more in a nonlinear way. That's great.
Yeah.
We're in the fifth idea, is the ManyWorlds idea. This reminds me of something I heard. I think what it's saying kind of relates to what you were just saying about things being fixed. And I just heard something about scientists that are in charge of the constants that we have and how they're having to tweak them because things are not as constant as we are led to believe. So anyway, tell me about the ManyWorlds idea and how that might inform me in business.
Yeah, it's kind of this thing about, even though, this, I guess this guy, one of these famous physicists, is talking about how there may be multiple universes. But I don't want to go that far. But it's this notion that when you measure something, it's impacted by the position and place from which you are measuring it.
Oh.
So you talked about, scientists about these constants, and what they're finding is that, it was this particular way because that's how we measured it. But as soon as you change everything around, you get this different result. Even though the thing that you're measuring is the same thing. My way of saying it is this: why don't we just say, well, maybe there's just multiple worlds out here, even though it's the same thing. They're just different. It's just different, right?
It's like a different
the point
view.
I'm trying to get at is to release this attachment to something being exactly as I see it.
Got you. Okay. So that really does make sense as far as people coming in, especially if you've got a team and they all have a slightly different idea and then they wonder why they can't come to a consensus. And maybe the fact that they have a different view could be used to really create a much more sound plan or several scenarios by maybe honoring those different views.
Well, I'll tell you where I see this very often is I will come into a company and we are trying to decide what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And it's amazing how many people have a different way of explaining the same problem.
Right. I mean, that applies to anything in life, right? Families,
right.
Any kind of team. That's great. So let's get to the sixth idea from quantum physics, which is something that a lot of people have probably heard of, the unified field theory. How do you explain that, and how would that apply to business?
Well, the unified field theory basically says that everything is connected to everything else. The universe is one interconnected energy field. And so this notion that there's some break or some discontinuity or that one thing doesn't impact the other is basically a fiction and a limitation of the human system of perception. If I look, like right now I'm looking out the window, and there seems to be nothing between me and the window. Of course there's air, but also there's energy between me and the window. And actually there is no separation between me and the window. It's just one massive energy system. Now, here's the way I can directly experience that. If there was an earthquake, and I'm in Northern California, then all of us would be moving. It reminds me of the meteor that hit in the Soviet Union, Russia, 2 months ago. and it knocked out windows for thousands of miles. And people were given a lesson that everything's interconnected because the shock wave from that meteor, blasts things for thousands of miles.
There's a theory or a fact, I guess, that if a butterfly flaps its wings in the U.S., it could affect the weather in China or something. I mean, is that part of that concept? Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know the science of that, but I think it does validate this notion that everything is interconnected. Now, here to me is an example, a way of seeing this in business. And what I call it is all-to-all strategy. And the best example of it to me is eBay. I found that the most fascinating company. Anybody can put anything up on eBay and sell it to anybody else.
I wonder if Wikipedia would also fall into that category in the sense that anybody can make an edit and then it affects the entire system globally.
Well, I think they do some screeners there, so they have to approve those edits, and they probably have screeners on eBay. They probably have certain things you can't sell on eBay, like your kidney or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right.
They don't want you to
humans.
do that.
Right.
But I think the idea of what I call all-to-all, I mean, this whole thing around file sharing, in the music business, was taken off really fast, and people said, oh, my God, we run us all out of business. But that was an all-to-all model as well. And I think what we are, when you're talking about technology and the like, that that's true is that the technology of communications is allowing all-to-all communications.
Yeah, and I heard just even today that people are using mobile devices more and more. And so if you think about the fact that people don't even have to go to their computer anymore to make a purchase or to post something, they can just do it wherever they are. That's really going to change things, I think, in an exponential way. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it will, and it's going to open up some new markets, but it's also going to be disruptive in a lot of markets because, as you know, when you have something like that, you have no barriers to entry, as an economist I'm thinking here, and therefore what happens is, the price collapses.
Right. And so this might be, when we were speaking earlier about a possible scenario, this is probably something companies need to consider, is that what happens if their major product or their best-selling product gets undermined by a new technology, then what would be their plan B, I guess, or C or D?
Yeah, we're watching this in the newspaper business because, pretty much Craigslist, just took out their one-ad business.
Yeah, for free classifieds.
Yeah, and so, local newspapers, beyond, some other, things in terms of internet advertising and all that, but basically the whole advertising market has moved away from a notion that people are going to get up in the morning, here we go with this time sequence of things, buy a big wad of paper, sit down, and read it.
So it almost seems like anything that contains information has the potential to be non-tangible in a way, and so any company that...
Say it has I would use the word disintermediated, which means there's a way for someone to get into your value chain and be an intermediary in some way that you had not anticipated, and then therefore you're in trouble. But again, there's also some upsides to that because you get not only lower prices, but you get new features, new products, new ideas. I'm not an Instagram user, but I understand it's really changing the marketplace in terms of advertising. People, throw things up, whether it's fashion or shoes or whatever, and this whole, as you said, this whole mobile world now that people get this instantaneous feedback. So it could actually be, speeding up the innovation loop because you have a closer connection with your final customer. And, I think all this is happening in the design space. Design is happening faster because there's more, interaction there. So, I'm not a Luddite or anything like that. But I do think, this can be disruptive. This does cause change, for sure.
Yeah, it's really going to, the spoils are going to go to the companies that can get that instant feedback and keep adapting to the customer desires, because it's really the customers that are driving it. So,
right. And I go back to say that the way they have to deal with this is this continuing openness, continuous learning, those kinds of things, I think, are the only strategies that they can really pursue.
Right. So I want to make sure we get through these ideas. You've got the final seventh idea from quantum physics is everything is energy. And we kind of touched upon this already. And I love this because I feel like I can use that to impact my world. So you were saying between you and the window, everything's energy. But isn't it all energy, even the window, even me, even the rocks and the computers and everything at the tiniest level? Is it all energy?
That's what we seem to be finding out, that they're, in this search for the ultimate particle, there's this concept called some God particle and the Higgs boson and, all this stuff that was in the news a little while ago. And they, even down at that level, they realized, well, Einstein's theory that, E equals mc squared, which basically all mass was things and nothing but energy, multiplied by some square of the speed of light. Yeah, you're right. Everything is energy. We have not found this ultimate particle. The universe seems to be made out of no thing. It seems to convert itself into things. Yeah, and so when I think about that, it's sort of, what is the energy, the ideas, the creativity? The first words in my book are thoughts are things. Mm-hmm. And the point I'm trying to get across there is that we think everything into existence.
Oh, I see.
Right? And if you go back to, the caveman in the forest, there were no cars there. There were no homes there. There were no computers there. There were no bridges there. We have thought all of this into existence. Right?
Oh, right.
Right. So the question is, when I think about energy as everything, I think of energy as that creative spark, those ideas, the values, the way of seeing the world. All that to me is energy in its unmanifested form. And then what we do is creative individuals is we go from idea, to thought to thing, and then the thing becomes, a house or a business or whatever. I go back to Apple Computer, and I think to me, the greatest business decision that Steve Jobs ever made, he made a lot of good ones, to me, was opening up the iPhone so that just about anybody could design an app and put it on there. They now have a insurmountable lead in terms of the apps that you can get on the iPhone and now you can use on your iPad. The reason they can charge a premium in the marketplace is because of that. But if you think about it, the only thing they did was have a very, very open approach to creativity, realizing their engineers wouldn't think of all the apps that people might possibly want. Again, all to all, right? And let everybody can. I have a friend who has an app on there that's a wedding planning app, right? Now, I'm pretty sure some highly trained MIT engineer working at Apple probably wouldn't have thought about a wedding planning app.
That's true.
So all the rest of these things, that people think of all these, I'm not a game player. My kids play some of these games, but I don't have time to play games on my iPhone. But apparently millions of people do. And I would have never thought of these games. But again, it's that, it's the energy, it's the creativity, it's the fire behind it. And that's why I say everything eventually comes from that. And I think very often people in companies, they get established, they get, as I say, these stuck, preconceived notions, and they forget the fact that if the company doesn't have any creative energy, its days are numbered.
Wow, that's a great point. So, in your book, The Art of Quantum Planning, you talk about reflective thinking and how it can stimulate insights related to those 7 ideas. What is reflective thinking, and how can a company use that?
Yeah, to me, reflective thinking is a way of asking yourself really, really tough questions. It's, why do I think that way? Why do I feel that way? Why do I see it that way? Now, this is not all the time pleasant, because very often you may stumble upon some weakness in yourself or something you're not proud of. But I've learned the way to get through those things is to face them and address them, right, and get help and those kinds of things. But this notion of reflective thinking is, in fact, someone says this is what separates man from other animals, is that, the other animal cannot think about what it just thought about.
That's true. So they can't take a perspective on their own thoughts.
Right.
At least that's what we believe.
Right. But to me, it's just sort of, if I have made a mistake, right, that I understand it and realize it and then make a positive adjustment.
So I could see, this just sounds like a really powerful technique. Have you worked with companies where people have been resistant to looking at their mistakes or maybe their own biases? Has that ever been a challenge?
Well, I'll say this. I said there are two kinds of companies that I have, 25 years of doing scenario planning that use this sort of, the scenario planning is also a version of reflective thinking, because it's a way of opening up and looking at these alternatives. What tends to happen is companies that have made a horrific mistake will realize, oh wow, we really need to we need to go at this differently, and then they bring in the consultants, right? They bring in the scenario planning and all the rest of these folks. Or those companies that are really trying to think ahead, and normally the companies that are really thinking ahead, when you talk to them, you'll find out that it's because they made some mistake in the past and they don't want to repeat it. Yeah, I think that's where it comes in at the corporate level. One of the things I ask company managers when I interview them before I get involved in a project, I ask them, well, what are some of the lessons that this company has learned?
Oh, that's good. So it sounds like you were saying some companies really want to figure this out before they make a big mistake. Are they actually looking at perhaps even disrupting their own business in a way, or trying to stay ahead by maybe changing their model before they have to?
I think the smart ones do, and there have certainly been some, companies that have done that. I think that's what Apple does with the innovation in the iPhone, and seems to be what Facebook is trying to do in some of its adjustments, is that they are, trying to stay ahead of the market and change the business model and not be stuck, I would say any company that is innovating very quickly because they understand the dynamics of their market will be doing this. And it's very often you read in the business press where a CEO may come in and says, okay, look, we need to get on this immediately. Stop what you're doing. Forget this and go to this over here, right? Of course, the classic example of that is, I guess Bill Gates was talking to some students at Columbia University many years ago before the Internet took off, and all these kids were talking about the Internet. And he says, what is this? And they said, oh, it's the Internet. And he says, what? And he immediately went back to Seattle and said, hey, what is this? We got to get on this thing. And, they were able to make a big adjustment with Explorer and a lot of other stuff. But, yeah, it is that, ability to, make that kind of quick recognition.
That's interesting. So I'm thinking about Bill Gates talking to students. Have you noticed a difference? Have you worked with companies, let's say, with younger people versus older, and maybe not older, but just more established businesses? And do you see a difference in their willingness to perhaps use some of these methods that you've developed?
I can't say that I can give you a good sense of the age demographics, because there are all kinds of people and companies that I work with because they're such large companies. I would probably say younger, innovative, or companies that are in fast-changing markets tend to be open to this kind of thinking. And they wouldn't call it quantum thinking. They would just call it something else. But there are companies who also, in these sort of established markets like energy in particular, because they have such huge risk and make such big investments, they also need to think this way, because they're going to put something in the ground that's going to be there for 30 or 40 years, like a power plant or a pipeline or whatever, and they need to have this kind of open thinking as well in terms of how to strategize and how to position that thing, how to finance it, and a whole lot of other questions that come up, that they want to build flexibility into a long-term asset.
So we just have a couple minutes left, and I remember reading something in your book about the importance of play. Can you just make a couple comments about that?
Yeah, it's sort of not taking yourself so seriously and having a sort of childlike, more humble mentality, because I think at that point you might be able to see and experience something differently because you're not holding on so tightly to your preconceived notions. It's when you are, when you're playing, you are, first of all, you're highly interactive. Like if you're playing baseball, you better know where the ball is, right? You don't want to get hit by the ball, right? So you have to be paying attention. But also, all your senses are involved, right? It's not just a mental thing; it's a physical thing, and you get into the other parts of your brain. And I think there's some of that, and very often when we are facilitating a team, we try to bring in some play. And one of the ones we like to do is to bring in a lot of balls. If you have 20 or 30 people in the room, just little tennis balls of different colors, and just have them throw the balls to each other around the room. So people are sort of, they have to pay attention. You have to signal to someone that you're sending them the ball. They have to catch it and send them. You get this sort of instantly complex environment, but it's also fun, and people loosen up, right? That's what I mean by the play aspect. It's a way of, in some kind of way, opening up your other senses and other ways of being, so you're experiencing life and what you're dealing with across a wider range than just your mental aspects of it.
That's so helpful, and I feel like today we've sort of been playing with ideas, so we're kind of carrying out what you're describing. So it looks like we're about out of time. Gerald, I'd like to thank you so much for being my guest. I do hope you'll come back and visit me again.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and I hope that your listeners get something out of these crazy ideas.
I'm sure they will. So next week, we're going to explore the power of collaboration with Michael Sussman, President of Strategic Rail Finance and On Track America. Be sure to check my host page on voiceamerica.com for full details. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Thank you for tuning in to Quantum Business Insights.